Idealization is not what most people think it is. It is not admiration, not infatuation, not chemistry, and not romance. In the structural language of MPIT, idealization is a replacement event. The moment a narcissist installs an internal fantasy object into another person, then behaves as if that fantasy is the real person standing in front of them. Everything that follows, the intensity, the alacrity, the mirroring, the declarations, the fusing, is the predictable outcome of one psychological fact. The narcissist is not relating to you, they are relating through you to a fantasy that predates you. This is the organizing illusion. And long before any explicit harm occurs, long before any devaluation, long before discard, long before collapse, the central damage has already begun. The survivor abandons their own internal equilibrium to keep the fantasy alive. To understand how and why this happens, we must start at the beginning, not with the narcissist's behavior, but with the survivor's felt experience. Because this is where MPIT diverges from every other model. MPIT maps the collapse from inside the survivor's world, from the first moment the internal structure is compromised. And the first compromise occurs during idealization, not after it. Idealization in MPIT is experienced by the survivor as a specific and unmistakable shift, a neurological, relational, and symbolic flooding event. The survivor feels seen, not vaguely, not pleasantly, but with a precision that is preternatural, as if the narcissist is reading their inner world without effort, speaking their internal language without learning it, mirroring their essence without being told anything. Survivors describe this as I felt recognized, I felt known, I felt chosen, I felt like they could see through me. It was like they were me. Despite variations in wording, the structural experience is the same, a rapid collapse of interpersonal distance. But beneath this sense of connection lies something far more subtle and far more important. Survivors sense almost immediately that something is off. It is never loud, never certain, never nameable. It is a faint, uncanny valley, a slight mismatch between expression and presence, a subtle hollowness behind the eyes, a warmth that feels disconnected. The gestures are perfect, the words are flawless, the attunement is immaculate, but something essential is missing. The survivor does not yet know how to interpret this absence. The body recognizes it before the mind can articulate it. This is the first signal that the survivor is being mirrored, not met. This mismatch, this micro absence, is annihilatory because it destabilizes the survivor's sense of relational grounding. The nervous system does not know how to metabolize an experience that feels both intimate and empty. The body swings between exhilaration and vertigo, and crucially, this produces a flood. Not a flood of love, not a flood of excitement, a flood of affect. Survivors misinterpret this as connection. In dynamic terms, it is the beginning of ASR1 activation, a survival level reflex rooted in pre-verbal need. I must secure this bond or I will be annihilated. The narcissist does not cause ASR1, the narcissist triggers ASR1. The survivor then unconsciously constructs something to contain the flood, a stabilizing internal identity structure. This is the false protector, the pseudo false self. It is not a narcissistic self state, It is an emergency adaptation to the annihilatory effect produced by idealization. It forms because the survivor cannot hold on to their true self under such psychological pressure. The false self takes the role the narcissist needs: the good enough mother, the stabilizer of the narcissist's internal world, the container of their dread and abandonment, the guarantee against loss. This happens within days for some survivors, within weeks for many, and within months for others. Its emergence does not depend on the survivor's weakness, but on the strength of their capacity for attunement. Those who are deeply empathetic, deeply responsive, deeply relational construct the false protector faster, not slower. This is why strong survivors fall the hardest. Their relational intelligence becomes the glue holding the shared fantasy together. While this is happening inside the survivor, something equally structured is happening inside the narcissist. Having projected into the survivor the internal fantasy mother, the idealized maternal frozen figure in the narcissist psyche, the narcissist begins monitoring whether the survivor will abandon them. This is not done consciously. It is not calculated manipulation. It is a reflexive structural test. Will you leave? Will you vanish like she did? Are you a stable internal object? Vaknin identifies these as abandonment tests. They occur early in the idealization phase, not once, but in distinct moments, three or four spikes where the narcissist inserts rupture, tension, or withdrawal. A day of sudden distance, a bizarre emotional inversion, a cold comment disguised as humour, a faint but shocking regression, a contradictory statement that makes no sense, a small but unmistakable moment of emotional absence. These are not devaluations, they are stability scans. The narcissist is not testing your mood, they are testing your role. If the survivor responds with reassurance, self blame, repair, or compliance, the narcissist registers them as safe, not emotionally safe, but fantasy safe, and idealization continues. This is why idealization can last from 6 months to 2 years. It lasts as long as the survivor is stabilizing the fantasy mother inside the narcissist. But it is also why idealization can end abruptly in weeks if the fantasy begins to destabilize, if the survivor shows autonomy, asserts boundaries, and fails to mirror with perfect precision. The narcissist senses the return of the maternal absence. This is where the grandiosity gap flickers open for the first time. Not the full rupture, just the smallest outline of discrepancy between who the narcissist believes themselves to be and the reality reflected back to them. When this gap opens, internal pressure rises. When survivors mirror correctly, the gap closes. When survivors mirror imperfectly, the gap widens. Every widening increases internal threat. Every closure restores fantasy coherence. This cycle is continuous, even if undetected. Meanwhile, the survivor feels only the front facing experience: intensity, love, connection, velocity, fusion. But behind that intensity, the narcissist's structural reality is beginning to fracture. The survivor does not know this because the survivor is living in the external version of the relationship, while the narcissist is living in the internal version. These two versions will never match, and the survivor will pay the price for that mismatch. The survivor experiences idealization as forward motion, a gathering intensity, pulling both parties closer. But structurally, beneath the surface, they are not moving forward at all. They are circling. This is because the narcissistic psyche cannot move towards an actual other. It only moves around its own internal world, attempting to maintain coherence through the use of external people. So, what feels like intimacy to the survivor is actually orbiting around the narcissist's internal void. This is not metaphorical, it is psychic topology. The narcissist does not approach the survivor, they revolve around an internal fantasy object they have placed inside the survivor. The survivor responding to this pull begins revolving as well. This mutual gravitational lock is what MPIT calls the early orbital phase. And it is here, early, quietly, invisibly, that the collapse is already seated. Because two incompatible structures are now fused. The survivor's true self, rooted in relational reciprocity, coherence, and mutuality. The narcissist's internal world, rooted in absence, fantasy, and maternal echo. The narcissist orbit requires the survivor to be a stabilizing gravitational center, but the survivor is not a center, they are a person. So the survivor unconsciously constructs one, the false protector. Now the narcissist orbits around that false structure, not the survivor's true self. And the survivor orbits around the narcissist's fantasy, not the narcissist's true self. This is why the survivor later says, I lost myself, or I wasn't me, or I don't know who I became, because they did become someone else, a mirror of the fantasy that had been placed inside them. Idealization continues as long as these orbits remain stable, which means as long as the gap between fantasy and reality remains narrow. But the gap cannot remain narrow forever. No human being can maintain the perfect mirroring required to stabilize a fantasy. No survivor can remain the idealized mother forever. No relational bond can hold the weight of internal absence indefinitely. And because the narcissist experiences the survivor inwardly, not outwardly, any deviation, no matter how small, is experienced as destabilization. But survivors do not see this destabilization. They only see the surface signals, a joke with a jab, a cold tone, a moment of detachment that feels unexplainable. They think it's interpersonal. It's not. It's structural. As the fantasy grows heavier, the narcissist begins leaning more heavily on the externalized version of the survivor. The survivor begins carrying more psychic weight than any human should carry. This is why the survivor begins feeling tired, confused, unsettled. The uncanny valley deepens. Moments of absence become more noticeable. But survivors reinterpret these signals through hope, not reality. I think they're just stressed. They're scared of being hurt. They've been through so much. They need reassurance. They're vulnerable. These interpretations are not naive. They are compassionate. They reflect the survivor's true nature, but they also reflect an error. The survivor believes the narcissist's emotional responses are relational. They are not. They are reflexive collapses inside the narcissist's own fantasy. This is why survivors miss the early warning signs. They think they are navigating a relationship when in reality they are navigating a psychic field. Inside the narcissist, the internal fantasy object begins to destabilize. This destabilization occurs quietly, then violently, depending on the pressure of the grandiosity gap. When the fantasy is intact, the narcissist feels elation, expansion, aliveness. This is the narcissistic high. But when the fantasy wobbles, the narcissist feels dread, constriction, implosion. This is the narcissistic injury. The survivor cannot predict when this will occur. It is not triggered by the survivor's behavior, but by the narcissist's internal oscillations. One moment the fantasy holds, the next moment it buckles. The survivor cannot prevent this. The survivor cannot foresee this. The survivor cannot change this. because the survivor is not the cause. The survivor is the screen onto which the cause is projected. This becomes crucial later when survivors blame themselves for the collapse, because to the narcissist, the collapse comes from the survivor. But structurally, the collapse comes from within the narcissist and is merely experienced through the survivor. This is why narcissists say, "You changed, you disappointed me, you ruined it, you switched off, you stopped being who you were." They are describing the collapse of the fantasy object inside them, not the behavior of the survivor outside them. But to the survivor, these statements land as direct accusations. They trigger guilt, shame, confusion, panic, and abandonment fear. This is when reflexive mirrored psychic inversion begins to form. The survivor, sensing their loss of coherence, begins monitoring the narcissist's internal state obsessively. They try to adjust themselves to restore the lost consistency. They begin relating to the fantasy object the narcissist placed inside them, not the real person in front of them. This is the mirror inversion, where once the narcissist related to the fantasy through the survivor, now the survivor relates to the fantasy through the narcissist. This is the moment the true self begins to slip out of reach. But the collapse does not happen yet. This is the pre collapse stage. The survivor is confused but not terrified, destabilized but not shattered, hyper attuned but not fragmented. The narcissist is dysregulated but not cold, detached but not rejecting, irritable but not contemptuous. There is still the illusion of us. There is still repair. There is still warmth at times. There is still seduction. There is still idealization intermittently. This is the silent pre collapse period. In this period, both parties are now orbiting, but they are no longer orbiting the same object. The shared fantasy is splitting at the center. The survivor believes they are trying to restore a bond. The narcissist is trying to restore an internal object. Neither can succeed, but neither knows this yet. This is why this part of the cycle is so disorienting. It is the quiet erosion before the storm. The first true narcissistic injury does not feel like a crisis to the survivor. It feels like a shift, a faint cooling, a subtle withdrawal, a moment you can't quite name. You might recall the exact sentence they reacted to. You might replay it 100 times, but you will not be able to understand why that moment, trivial, accidental, neutral, triggered something so disproportionate. To you, it is a misunderstanding. To them, it is a psychic collapse. Because the narcissistic injury is not an emotional wound, it is the rupture of an internal object. The fantasy mother they installed inside you flickers, glitches, or momentarily disappears. It does not matter what you said, it matters what your words meant inside their internal world. Meaning that the narcissist assigns to your behavior is not relational, it is symbolic, rooted in their earliest internal template. When the object displeases me, the object is abandoning me, and if the object is abandoning me, I am about to collapse. The survivor cannot see this symbolic logic. They only see the surface behavior, the sudden freeze, the blank stare, the emotional flatness, the switch off, the inexplicable change in tone, the chilling absence in their eyes. Survivors often describe it in simple terms. Something left. They changed. It was like I was suddenly looking at a stranger. I felt a void appear between us. This is not metaphor, it is the literal return of the narcissist's internal absence. The dead mother complex re-emerges, the fantasy mother collapses, the internal object fractures. And because you were the one holding the fantasy together, you became the one blamed for its collapse. But the narcissist cannot articulate this. They do not say, the internal maternal object has destabilized. They say, you hurt me. You let me down. You disappointed me. you changed, you made me feel unsafe. These statements are not interpersonal truths, they are internal hallucinations. But to the survivor, they sound like accusations. And because survivors are relationally attuned, they respond relationally. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, I didn't know, I'll fix it, please talk to me. The narcissist interprets this not as repair, but as confirmation that the fantasy is still valid. If they are apologizing, then the fantasy mother still exists. This is why the cycle continues for a while, not because the narcissist forgives, but because the fantasy object restabilizes temporarily. Meanwhile, the survivor begins to warp internally. They begin scanning themselves. They begin doubting their tone, their wording, their timing, their intentions, their feelings, their needs. They begin shrinking, not consciously, structurally. This is the first shift into ASR2, the anticipatory self correcting, self erasing reflex, meant to prevent abandonment. Again, this is not immaturity. This is not naive love. This is a deep ancient survival mechanism. And while the survivor is contracting internally, the narcissist is contracting externally. This is when the coldness truly begins. Not contempt, not cruelty, not punishment, coldness, a neutralizing of all warmth, the cancellation of emotional reciprocity, the shutting down of mutuality, the withdrawal of the fantasy's glow. Coldness is the narcissist's default state when the internal object destabilizes. It is not aimed at you. It is not even about you. It is the narcissist retreating into the autoerotic closed loop that predates all their adult relationships. But survivors do not know this. They interpret coldness as punishment or anger or disappointment or rejection. And the survivor's nervous system responds not with logic, but with terror, because coldness is annihilatory. It is the dead mother dynamic, felt somatically. It is abandonment encoded in the body. It is pre verbal dread. And this dread activates ASR3, the collapse reflex that drives the survivor into the unconscious, where meaning collapses and survival becomes the sole priority. When ASR3 activates, the survivor instinctively tries to restore the bond, not through communication, but through self sacrifice. They apologize for things they do not do. They repress needs they genuinely feel. They silence boundaries they truly require. They shrink their own presence. They amplify the narcissist's needs. They abandon their internal world to stabilize the narcissist's external behavior. This is the beginning of reflexive mirrored psychic inversion, or MPI. The survivor begins relating to themselves through the narcissist's internal perception. They lose access of their own self authorship. They lose clarity on their own intentions. They lose the internal good object, the felt sense of being fundamentally coherent, fundamentally whole, fundamentally safe. And the narcissist, instead of perceiving this as devotion, perceives it as compliance, which deepens the fantasy structure and delays the collapse. The survivor, without knowing it, is now living inside the narcissist's psyche while simultaneously losing access to their own. This is the dangerous middle zone between idealization and devaluation. Nothing is explicit yet, nothing is named, nothing is openly cruel, but everything is destabilizing. The shared fantasy is now cracking at the center. You try to save what you think is a relationship, but what you are trying to save is the narcissist fantasy object, and it is impossible to save an object that never actually existed. This is why survivors work so hard in this stage. It is not overinvestment, it is not desperation, it is not codependency, it is inversional instinct. You are trying to prevent a collapse that your body believes will annihilate you. And that belief is not irrational, because when the fantasy collapses, you will collapse. Not because you are weak, but because you were holding two psyches together. Coldness is not devaluation. Coldness is the precondition for devaluation. Coldness is not anger, not disappointment, not hatred. It is the disappearance of the internal fantasy mother, the sudden vacuum created when the internal object collapses. This vacuum produces a structural necessity inside the narcissist. They must now protect themselves from the emotional consequences of an internal collapse they cannot regulate. Devaluation begins at this point, not as a choice, not as a punishment, but as a structural defense against annihilatory anxiety. When the internal object fails, the narcissist falls into what MPIT describes as the autoerotic loop, a closed, solipsistic psychic chamber where the narcissist relates only to themselves. In this state, the narcissist no longer sees the survivor as a person, a partner, or an attachment figure. They now perceive the survivor as the cause of their internal collapse. Not because the survivor caused it, but because the narcissist psyche cannot tolerate the idea that the collapse originates within themselves. So the psyche does the only thing it can do. It externalizes the source of internal pain. This is the beginning of devaluation. Devaluation is not contempt. Contempt is what you see. Devaluation is the structural mechanism behind what you see. Inside the narcissist, the logic is simple. If I am collapsing, it must be because you failed me. If I feel abandoned, it must be because you are abandoning me. If my fantasy is dissolving, it must be because you destroyed it. If I am empty, it must be because you took something from me. This generates the emotional posture survivors recognize as contempt. But contempt is not the cause, it is the mask. The cause is terror. The narcissist's internal terror is existential, not emotional. It is the terror of early infancy, the dread of the dead mother, the terror of the maternal absence, the collapse of the inner world. And because they cannot metabolize this terror internally, they project it onto the survivor and then attack the external object to silence the internal threat. This is the moment the survivor feels the switch, the moment warmth becomes hostility, the moment closeness becomes distance, the moment idealization becomes rejection. It is the moment the narcissist's internal absence becomes the survivor's external reality. For the survivor, this shift is shattering because it violates every rule of relational logic. One day earlier, the relationship still had coherence, moments of warmth still flickered, connection still felt possible, repair still seemed viable. Then suddenly, they look at you differently, they speak differently, they touch differently, they listen differently, they breathe differently. You feel like you are in the presence of another person. And in a structural sense, you are. The narcissist is no longer relating to the fantasy object inside you. They are now relating to the internal danger sign they have projected onto you. And because the survivor's nervous system has already shifted into reflexive mirrored psychic inversion, this sudden reversal creates catastrophic internal pressure. The survivor now experiences pressure to restore connection, pressure to correct behavior, pressure to become who they were before, pressure to be perfect, pressure to avoid triggering further collapse, pressure to prevent abandonment, pressure to self erase to maintain the bond. These pressures do not arise from logic, they arise from ASR3, the collapse reflex that drives the survivor inward, stripping away all secondary psychological processes and leaving only the most primal instinct. If I don't fix this, I cease to exist. This is not an exaggeration. It is not a poetic lesson. It is not poetic language. It is the literal somatic truth of collapse. And it is the first doorway into collapse-induced psychotic regression. CIPR is not delusion, not psychosis in the clinical sense. It is a symbolic regression into the pre-verbal self where the psyche splits into fragments to survive overwhelming emotional reality. And the split begins here. The survivor's psyche fractures into distinct self states. The Redeemer, the self state that believes reconciliation is salvation. It holds the childhood wish: if I am good enough, they will love me. The mute child, the pre verbal self state, carrying pure terror, wordless dread, and the feeling of annihilation. This is the core of ASR1. The false protector, the pseudo false self created during idealization, now obsessed with self correction, compliance, and controlling the survivor's behavior to prevent further rupture. The introject enforcer, the internalized maternal split of the narcissist, the idealized mother and the rejecting mother, now living inside the survivor, punishing them for the fantasy's collapse. These four parts do not appear sequentially. They appear simultaneously. They collide, they overlap, they fight for dominance inside the psyche. This is the beginning of the chorus of chaos. The survivor no longer experiences a single self. They experience four competing selves, each trying to survive a collapse that has not yet fully unfolded, but has already begun internally. And the narcissist behavior worsens this fragmentation. They become inconsistent, they become unpredictable, they become contradictory. They oscillate between moments of warmth and cruelty, connection and distance, entitlement and indifferences. These oscillations do not merely confuse the survivor, they utterly destabilize them because the survivor's psyche is now inverted. Your nervous system begins responding to their internal world before their external behavior even changes. You feel the collapse before you see it. You sense the rejection before it happens. You anticipate cruelty before it arrives. You live in a state of suspended terror, and this is what opens the doorway to full collapse. By the time the survivor reaches this stage, the collapse is no longer relational, it is internal. CIPR begins not when the narcissist discards, but when the survivor's psyche recognizes that the fantasy has collapsed and that they no longer know who they are in relation to themselves. The survivor does not constantly think this, they feel it somatically. CIPR is the symbolic moment where the internal good object disappears, their self concept dissolves, all psychic energy collapses towards the unconscious, the self fractures into multiple competing states, meaning becomes unmoored from experience, time becomes distorted, and the survivor becomes both present and absent in their own life. This is the heart of MPIT. The collapse is not caused by losing the narcissist, but by losing the version of yourself that only existed inside the shared fantasy. The loss of this internal good object is experienced as psychological death because it was constructed out of the narcissist fantasy, the survivor's hope, the survivor's attunement, the survivor's co-idealization, the survivor's internalized maternal template, the bi-directional object exchange, the false protector, the mirrored internal world, the fantasy mother loop. When that object is destroyed, the survivor loses the internal mirror that reflected them back to themselves. This is why survivors say, I don't know who I am. I feel like I died. I feel empty. I feel unreal. These are not metaphors, they are the actual symptoms of internal object destruction. The psyche cannot tolerate this level of internal loss, so it fractures into the four self states I described earlier. The Redeemer attempts to restore the fantasy, attempts to resurrect what was lost, attempts to negotiate with absence, attempts to repair the internalized object. This state believes reconciliation is salvation because the self concept is inside that reconciliation. The mute child feels only dread, wordless pre-verbal dread. This is pure ASR1, the original annihilatory reflex, unprocessed and language-less. This is why survivors struggle to describe their pain. It precedes language. The false protector tries to control behavior, tries to minimize the survivor's emotional needs, tries to keep the peace, tries to fix things, becomes hypervigilant, perfectionistic, self-blaming, compliant. It says, you're overreacting. Don't be dramatic. Just calm down. Don't push them away. The protector does not protect. It suppresses. The introject enforcer. This is the most dangerous part. It is the narcissist's internal maternal split, the idealized mother and the rejecting mother, now inside the survivor, punishing them for the collapse. This is the voice that says, you're worthless, you destroyed it, no one will love you, you failed, you're the problem, you deserve this, you are unlovable. Survivors often mistake this as their own voice. It is not. It is the narcissist's internal world now living inside yours. This is the double injury. First, the loss of the internal good object, then the installation of the narcissist's internal bad object. Andre Green's dead mother complex now operates in reverse. You lose the good internal figure, and the dead mother, their dead mother, becomes yours. This is the precise moment survivors develop the sensation of, I feel hollow, I feel like something has died inside me, I can't feel love, I feel disconnected from everyone, I don't trust my feelings, I am terrified of myself. This is not depression, this is not grief, this is internal object substitution. You lost your good object and you inherited theirs. Now the psyche begins to fold inward. This is the moment Imra appears, inverse mirrored reflexive apathy. Imra is not emotional numbness, it is the felt presence of the narcissist's absence, lost inside the survivor's emotional circuitry. Imra manifests as inability to feel warmth, inability to feel connection, inability to feel empathy towards oneself, inability to feel real, inability to experience comfort, inability to locate emotional truth, inability to trust one's own intentions, inability to recognize one's own goodness. Imra is the narcissist's internal world, mirrored through the survivor's unconscious after collapse. And because Imra is cold, and because it feels like reality, survivors believe that they have become cold. They have not. They are feeling the narcissist's absence inside their own body. This is the inversion. CIPR completes the inversion by creating fractured self, inverted emotional logic, reverse attribution of blame, distorted relational memory, loss of continuity of self, splitting across internal objects, symbolic implosion, somatic dread, derealization, depersonalization, dissociation, panic, and collapse into the unconscious. The survivor is not breaking down. The survivor is operating under a full psychic load that no human being is designed to carry. They are carrying their own nervous system, the narcissist nervous system, the narcissist maternal split, the dead mother, the fantasy that collapsed, the internal good object that was destroyed, the internal bad object that replaced it, the pseudo false self, the redeemer, the mute child, the introject enforcer, the false protector, the absence, the dread, the grief, the guilt, the shock, the collapse, the loss of reality coherence, the collapse of self authorship, the collapse of time, the collapse of meaning. This is why collapse feels total. But it is not total, because the true self has not died. It has been covered. It waits under the noise. But reaching it takes time, because the psyche must survive the descent before it can begin to reintegrate. The collapse is not the end, it is the beginning of reconstitution. By the time the psyche enters full CIPR. The collapse no longer behaves like an emotional event, it behaves like gravity. This is why MPIT names the next stage orbital collapse. When a star collapses, it does not fall inward cleanly. Its outer layers shear, fragment, and spiral before being pulled into the center. This is exactly what happens inside the survivor's psyche. Orbit by orbit, layer by layer, belief by belief, the internal world begins to spiral towards a vanishing center. But unlike a dying star, the survivor's center does not disappear. It becomes temporarily inaccessible. The psyche is not dying, it is folding. This distinction matters. The survivor never loses their true self. They lose access to the true self because the collapse has forced all psychic energy inward toward containment, toward survival, toward managing the internal war between the fractured parts. That inward pull creates what MPIT calls full reflexive mirrored psychic inversion. Where earlier the survivor was attuning to the narcissist's internal world reflexively, now they internalize it as if it were their own. This is the deepest inversion. The survivor's psyche turns against itself, not out of self hatred, but out of structural confusion. If the collapse feels like it's coming from me, then I must be the problem. This is not a belief, it is a felt certainty rooted in the loss of the internal good object. Without the good object, the stable internal reference for self worth, the psyche defaults to the only remaining internal voice, the introject enforcer. This is why survivors at this stage say, I think I'm the narcissist. I think I'm broken. I don't trust my mind. I feel like I'm dangerous. I feel like I ruined everything. I think I deserved it. I think everyone would be better without me. These are not cognitive distortions. They are the introject enforcer in full control. The narcissist's maternal split now fuse with the survivor's self concept. It is at this depth that memory distortion begins. Not false memories, distorted meanings. The survivor begins replaying scenes of the relationship, but with the narcissist's internal interpretation superimposed. Moments of kindness become naive. Moments of boundary setting become hostile. Moments of self care become selfish. Moments of confusion become manipulative. This is not self gaslighting. This is the internalized logic of the narcissistic collapse now running inside the survivor's mind. This is what Vacton means when he says the survivor becomes a node inside the narcissist's internal theater. Even after the relationship ends, the internal theater continues inside the survivor because the collapse happened inside their psyche as well. At this stage, survivors begin to experience dissolution of relational memory. They know what happened, they can recall events, but they cannot feel the meaning attached to those memories. Everything becomes flattened, hollow, perplexing. Moments of joy are little to none, and if they arrive, they are felt as unreal. Moments of connection feel embarrassing. Moments of love feel delusional. Moments of hurt feel deserved. This is symbolic implosion. The entire relational narrative collapses inward because the self that's lived it has collapsed inward. This is also why survivors begin saying things like, it felt like it happened to someone else. I don't know if it was real. I feel like I'm watching my own life from the outside. I don't recognize the person I was or who I have become. These statements are not dissociation in the clinical sense, but collapse of continuity, the inability to track oneself across the timeline of the relationship, because the self concept holding that timeline together has dissolved. At this depth, the psyche reaches bottom, the point where fragmentation, absence, imra, dread, and symbolic collapse reach maximum density. The survivor experiences inability to attach, inability to detach, inability to feel, inability to stop feeling, overwhelming silence, overwhelming noise, craving connection, fearing connection, clinging to the fantasy, rejecting the fantasy, longing for the narcissist, hating oneself, fearing oneself, feeling unreal, feeling too real, feeling empty, feeling full of dread, losing hope, fearing hope, craving meaning, rejecting meaning, wanting the pain to stop, fearing who they will be without the pain. This is not contradiction. This is the collapse of dualities. The psyche cannot maintain symbolic differentiation when the internal good object is gone and the internal bad object is in control. This is the psychological bottom. This is the place where many survivors believe they will not survive. This is the phase where suicidal ideation will emerge, not out of desire to die, but out of the belief that the collapse will never end. And yet, this is also the moment where healing becomes possible, because the psyche has emptied out everything that was never truly yours: the fantasy, the projection, the introject, the dead mother, the narcissist's absence, the false protector, the fractures, the inversion, the dread, the object you were forced to become. At the bottom of collapse, the survivor is left with a kind of unbearable stillness, a stillness that feels like nothingness, but is actually the silence before reintegration. This is where the true self begins to stir. It does not emerge in triumph. It does not burst through the darkness. It does not announce itself. It waits, because it knows that if it emerges too soon, the collapsing structure will attach to it and it will be contaminated. So the true self waits until the collapse has fully played out, until the fantasy mother loop is dead, until the internalized bad object has exhausted its energy, until the introject enforcer weakens, until Imra begins to thin, until the redeemer grows quiet, until the false protector loosens its grip, until the mute child stops screaming. Only then does the psyche enter the next phase. Recovery does not begin when the narcissist leaves. Recovery begins when the narcissist's internal world begins to lose its power. This is not a moment you can mark on a calendar. It is not an insight, a breakthrough, a revelation, a decision, or a declaration. It is a slow weakening of the internal forces that once dominated you. The survivor does not feel stronger at first. They feel emptier. The emptiness is frightening because the psyche confuses emptiness with absence and absence with annihilation. But in MPIT symbolic mapping, emptiness is not absence, it is space. Space is the first sign of reintegration. As orbital collapse finishes, the internal war exhausts itself. The Redeemer tires, the false protector falters, the introject enforcer grows hoarse, the mute child retreats into silence. This is not healing, this is depletion, but depletion is the beginning of clearing. The psyche can only rebuild once the internal noise no longer blocks the deeper signal of the true self. This is the first major transition after the collapse. The internalized narcissistic architecture loses momentum. The internal bad object, the narcissist rejecting maternal split, begins to flicker instead of dominate. Every time it weakens, the survivor feels a moment of clarity. I'm not the monster. I think I remember who I was. I don't think that voice is mine. I think something happened to me. I think I was used. I didn't deserve that. These thoughts do not appear as triumphs, they appear as doubts. At this stage, doubt is progress, because doubt interrupts the interject's control. As the interject weakens, Imra, the cold absence that felt like your new identity, begins to thin. Not disappear, thin. Imra does not vanish like smoke, it dissolves like fog. One day you feel no warmth, the next day you feel 1% warmth, and then none again, then 2%, then none, then 5%. This is the thaw. It is uneven. It is confusing. It is subtle. It is maddening. Survivors often misinterpret the thaw as regression. I think I'm going backwards. I feel worse today. Everything was clearer yesterday. Why am I numb again? Why can't I hold on to the progress? This is not regression. This is the nervous system recalibrating, testing the environment, dipping in and out of emotional presence to see whether reality is safe enough for the true self to re enter. In MPIT, this phase is understood as symbolic reoxygenation. The psyche breathes for the first time in months, but the breaths are shallow, erratic, inconsistent. It is the slow relearning of autonomy, the slow relearning of separateness, the slow relearning of emotional ownership. This is what survivors experience as, I think I'm coming back, followed by, oh God, I think I'm losing myself again. This oscillation is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the internalized narcissistic world is losing its grip. As IMRA thins, the survivor begins to experience flickers of self recognition, not self esteem, not self love, not confidence, recognition. This difference is important. Recognition is the moment the true self sees itself again, without distortion, without inversion, without the narcissist's internal world superimposed. It is subtle but unmistakable. It appears as a memory that finally feels real, a feeling that finally makes sense, an intention that finally feels genuine, a boundary that suddenly feels justified, a moment of self compassion that feels true rather than forced, a moment of anger that feels rightful, not shameful, a moment of neutrality that feels peaceful, not numb, a moment of breathing that feels like your own rhythm. These are early signs of recoherence. Recoherence is not healing, it is the re establishment of symbolic order. The psyche begins reorganizing itself around the true self rather than around the collapse. This is the first internal pivot. It does not feel triumphant, it feels fragile. Survivors often describe the early return of the true self as, I had a moment where I felt like me again. It was tiny, but real. I lost it again, but I know it was there. I feel like there's someone underneath all this. I think I'm still in here somewhere. These statements are not hope, they are evidence. The true self never died. It was submerged beneath the collapse while the psyche battled the internalized world of the narcissist. Now that the collapse has exhausted itself, the true self can begin resurfacing. Not in one moment, in thousands. But this resurfacing is only possible because something else has happened. The narcissist's internal world has begun to lose authority. This is the crucial turning point of MPIT. The narcissist no longer governs the survivor's self worth, the survivor's emotional logic, the survivor's internal moral narrative, the survivor's internal maternal template, the survivor's sense of reality, the survivor's interpretation of themselves, the survivor's symbolic order, the survivor's meaning making, the survivor's relational experiences. Their internal architecture begins to dissolve because the psyche finally recognizes it as foreign. This recognition does not happen cognitively, it happens symbolically when the internalized voice no longer feels true. At this point, wounded as they are, the survivor is no longer fully inside the narcissist's psychic system. They are standing at its edge, and for the first time since the collapse began, they can turn round towards themselves. Reintegration does not begin with strength, it begins with weakness. The survivor reaches a point where the collapse has expended itself. There is no more psychic material for the inner war to feed on. The internal world becomes quieter, not peaceful, but quieter. This is the moment the psyche begins reorganizing, not rebuilding, not healing, not thriving, reorganizing. Reintegration begins with the question, what part of me is speaking? This question appears subtly, often in a moment of distress when the survivor notices that a voice inside them is familiar but not theirs. It may be harsh, it may be punishing, it may be belittling, it may be despairing, but in that moment something shifts. The survivor recognizes that the voice is separate. This separation is crucial. It is the first step towards disidentification, the recognition that internal experiences are not uniform, not singular, not all me. The fractured parts become visible for the first time. The redeemer, the mute child, the false protector, the introject enforcer. They are no longer fused. They are no longer screaming over one another. They begin to differentiate. That differentiation is not pleasant. It is painful because the survivor now hears each part clearly and must confront its origins. The Redeemer appears exhausted, still clinging to the fantasy, still whispering, "We can fix this." But the survivor now recognizes it as a wish, not a truth. The mute child no longer consumes the psyche. Its terror becomes identifiable. This is the part of me that felt abandoned long before the narcissist arrived. This is my pre-verbal wound, not the narcissist's voice. The false protector becomes transparent. The survivor sees that this part is not strong, it is terrified of loss, and tries to control behavior to prevent abandonment. The introject enforcer becomes fully exposed. This is not my morality. This is not my fear. This is the narcissist's internal maternal split living in me. This is the dead mother architecture masquerading as my conscience. Once each part is named, reintegration can begin. The psyche does not merge these parts, it repositions them. The Redeemer becomes a memory. Its longing loses force, its fantasies lose coherence, it stops driving behavior. The mute child becomes a feeling state, not a determinant of reality. The false protector becomes a tool, not a tyrant, a reminder of when you needed to survive, but no longer the one steering the ship. The introject enforcer loses its authority because you can now see its origin and recognize it as foreign. As these parts lose their executive power, space opens, and into this space returns the internal good object. The good object is not a mother, not an imaginary parent, not the narcissist fantasy, not a memory of childhood. The internal good object is the felt sense of inner safety that underpins selfhood. It is symbolic coherence. It is emotional continuity. It is the internal home. During collapse, this object was destroyed, not literally, but functionally. It ties to the self concept were severed. Now it begins to return, slowly, quietly, steadily. It does not return because you forgive yourself. It does not return because you do the work. It does not return because you heal your inner child. It returns because the psyche has finally expelled the internalized architecture of the narcissist. Reintegration is the moment the narcissist stops living inside you. Only then can your own internal world reclaim its territory. As the internal good object returns, it begins stabilizing the survivor's emotional reality. Feelings become recognizable again, feelings become nameable again, feelings become trustworthy again. Anger feels like anger, not abandonment. Sadness feels like sadness, not collapse. Longing feels like longing, not fantasy. Neutrality feels like peace, not numbness. This clarity allows the psyche to begin rebuilding the self concept. The self concept is not personality, it is not identity, it is not preferences or traits. The self concept is the organized center of the psyche, the place from which you interpret yourself. During the shared fantasy, your self concept was built from the narcissist gaze, the fantasy mother loop, co idealization, bi directional object acquisition, the false protector, the internalized dead mother, the introject enforcer, the borrowed fantasy of being special, the fear of abandonment, ASR1, ASR3, and reflexive mirrored psychic inversion. This self concept shattered during collapse. Now, with the internalized narcissistic word dissolving, the psyche must reconstruct the self concept from the inside out. This building is not dramatic, it is not empowering, it is not euphoric, it is subtle, it is quiet, and it is slow. It begins with sentences like, "I think I know what I feel. I think this is what I want. I think this is okay for me. I don't have to justify this. This boundary feels right. This reaction feels reasonable. This memory feels accurate. This version of me feels true. These are not affirmations, they are milestones. Each one is a brick in the reconstruction of self authorship. This is what MPIT calls vertical authorship, the restoration of the internal axis of identity. The survivor moves from horizontal scanning, external regulation, to vertical grounding, internal regulation. This shift is the beginning of true autonomy. Autonomy does not feel like freedom at first, it feels like exposure, because you are no longer protected by the pseudo false self, nor driven by the redeemer, nor policed by the interjecting enforcer. You stand without the old architecture. This vulnerability is the sign of reintegration, because now, for the first time since collapse began, your emotional responses belong to you. This is the point survivors begin saying, I feel like myself again. Not completely, not consistently, not continuously, but recognizably. This recognition, momentary as it is the return of the true self. It is the first signal that the collapse is ending and reintegration has begun. Reintegration is not the end of the story, but it is the beginning of the real one. Because the collapse was never about healing the relationship or moving on or finding closure or letting go. It was always about reclaiming authorship of your own mind. Authorship is the final stage in MPIT. It is what every other stage was working toward, often without you realizing it. Authorship is not happiness, not confidence, not empowerment, not strength. Authorship is ownership, ownership of perception, ownership of narrative, ownership of emotion, ownership of self. To understand the final stage, we must trace the arc from collapse to reclamation, because the endpoint is the exact inversion of the beginning. The collapse ends when borrowed reality ends. All collapse is a double collapse, the collapse of the relationship and the collapse of the internal world the relationship constructed. But collapse only truly ends when the psyche stops living in the borrowed structure of the shared fantasy. This is why survivors remain in pain long after the narcissist is gone. They are still living inside the narcissist's symbolic world. The collapse ends when the internalized fantasy dissolves, when the survivor stops supplying the absence, stops rehearsing imagined reconciliations, stops answering the interjecting forcer, stops chasing the redeemer's longing, stops obeying the false protector's rules, stops parenting the mute child with terror instead of care. When the internal world shifts from being a house they live in to a house they own, the collapse is over, not before. Authorships begin with truth. It wasn't me. The moment of authorship arrives quietly. It does not announce itself. It does not feel grand. It does not feel victorious. It feels like a simple, subtle clarity. I can see what was mine and what wasn't. This is the exact mirror inversion of the shared fantasy, where the survivor could not distinguish their emotions from the narcissist's internal world. In the shared fantasy, you felt their emptiness, you carried their shame, you mirrored their idealization, you contained their abandonment terror, you absorbed their dead mother architecture, you held their internal objects as if they were yours, you lived their absence as your own. Authorship begins when this fusion ends, when emotions become traceable, when thoughts become nameable, when the voices have identifiable origins, when the narcissist's internal world no longer feels like part of yours. This is the moment the psyche becomes yours again. The survivor rebuilds the internal good object. The collapse destroyed the internal good object, the symbolic anchor of safety and continuity. During idealization, this object was projected into the narcissist, then reabsorbed with their absence attached to it. The internal good object was contaminated, overwritten, and finally shattered. Reconstruction begins in reintegration, but completes here. The internal good object returns as a stable emotional reference, a trustworthy sense of inner self, a felt sense of continuity. the ability to soothe oneself without collapsing, the ability to tolerate uncertainty without splitting, the capacity to exist without external validation. When the internal good object is restored, the survivor stops collapsing into ASR3, stops internalizing absence. ASR1 calms down, stops anticipating annihilation, and the organizing gate restores itself. Real perception replaces borrowed perception. This restoration is the quiet rebirth of selfhood. The collapsed narrative becomes symbolic, not literal. The final stage is marked by a profound shift. What happened to you stops being a story you live in and becomes a story you understand. Collapse ceases to be a lived reality and becomes a symbolic map. You no longer re experience the trauma, you interpret it. You no longer inhabit the chaos, you observe it. You no longer fear the vortex, you understand its mechanics. This shift from literal experience to symbolic comprehension is the hallmark of returned authorship. It means the psyche is no longer in the collapse, no longer acting out its fragments, no longer reacting to phantom objects. You're outside the system that once consumed you. This is freedom, not the emotional high of liberation, but the clarity of separation. The narcissist's absence no longer shapes you. The narcissist's internal world once governed your reality. Their absence was inside your body. Their voice was inside your mind. Their dead mother split was inside your emotional core. Their internal chaos dictated your internal state. In authorship, this dissolves. The narcissist becomes what they always were, a psychological event, not a psychic owner. Their absence loses its gravitational pull. Their object no longer replaces the good object. Their fantasy no longer binds your identity. Their voice no longer overrides your own. Their internal mother no longer competes with your internal world. They become external again. And in that moment, the survivor experiences the most shocking truth. I was never the person they were relating to. This truth, once unbearable, becomes liberating. It unties the last knot. The internal parts reposition into a singular self system. Reintegration differentiated the parts. Authorship reorganizes them. Each part finds its proper place. The Redeemer becomes an origin story, not a destiny. The mute child becomes a feeling state, not a terror. The false protector becomes an internal boundary, not a dictator. The introject enforcer becomes an artifact, not an authority. The true self returns to the vertical axis, steering consciousness with coherence and authorship. The psyche no longer fragments in response to stress. It no longer collapses into ASR3. It no longer anticipates annihilation through ASR1. It no longer loops RMPI, reflexive mirrored psychic inversion, to manage emotional overwhelm. The internal architecture stabilizes. The executive function returns to the self. This is the final integration. The survivor reclaims their narrative. Narrative theft by erasure ends. The narcissist is no longer the author of your emotional truth. The fantasy no longer the template for your self-concept. The collapse is no longer the organizer of your identity. You reclaim the ability to say, this is what happened, this is what I felt, this is what I lost, this is what I gained, and this is who I am now. The story is no longer a wound, it becomes wisdom. Not justification, not vengeance, not closure, wisdom. This is the point where survivors become teachers, not because they seek an audience, but because the clarity demands articulation. And in articulating the truth, they help others escape the collapse they once lived in. This is the final transformation. The internal world no longer collapses inward, it expands outward, offering coherence to others. The survivor returns to reality fully, not the partial reality of functioning, not the guarded reality of surviving, not the bitter reality of never again. A full, grounded, embodied reality in which the internal and external world align. This is the end of reflexive mirrored psychic inversion. This is the end of the narcissist psychic residency. This is the end of the collapse induced psychotic regression. This is the end of the shared fantasy symbolic life. This is the end of living through absence. The survivor becomes a whole person again, not the person they were before, a person who now understands the structure of collapse, the architecture of inversion, the mechanics of idealization, the symbolic nature of the false self, the internal logic of narcissism, the fracturing and reintegration of the self, the truth of authorship. This is the return, not to who you were, but to who you are. In the collapse, you lost your self concept, but your true self never left. It is waiting for the storm to finish so it can be found again. And now, in the final chapter, you'll find it exactly where it always was, beneath the noise of the collapse, beneath the borrowed emotions, beneath the interjected voices, beneath the fantasy, beneath the absence. You return home to yourself. This is the end of collapse and the beginning of authorship. This is the final chapter. Peace out. Loads of love.